Arrows, dust, distance. Then the realization that conquest means nothing when there's nothing to conquer. Summer 513 BC, Darius. I crossed the Bosphorus with 600,000 men, the greatest invasion force ever assembled, aiming to subjugate the Scythian tribes that controlled the vast steppe. Facing him, nomadic warriors who owned nothing permanent, defended nothing fixed, and understood something the Persians couldn't grasp. That space itself could be a weapon. The cultural collision was absolute. Persian infantry who built roads and monuments versus horsemen who could shoot backwards at full gallop while drinking fermented mare's milk. Empire versus freedom. Cities versus tents. Permanence versus motion. But here's what makes this invasion legendary. When it ended, 80,000 Persians lay dead on the steppe, not from a single great battle. From chasing ghosts through grass until empire itself learned the meaning of defeat. By 513 BC, Darius I had built something the world had never seen. An empire that stretched from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea, from Egypt's deserts to the steppes of Central Asia. 20 satrapies. 44% of the entire human population under a single ruler. The Achaemenid Persian Empire wasn't just powerful, it was the definition of power. Consider the scale. Darius commanded armies that had crushed Babylon, subjugated Egypt, conquered the Ionian Greeks. His engineers built roads that connected continents. His postal system could carry messages 1,500 miles in a week, faster than any communication network for the next 2,000 years. His treasury held wealth that made other kingdoms look like villages. The Persian military machine was perfection itself. Professional soldiers organized in units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. The immortals, 10,000 elite guards whose ranks were immediately filled when casualties occurred, creating the illusion of an army that never diminished. Cavalry from a dozen nations, infantry trained in formations that could wheel and maneuver with precision no European army would match for centuries. But here's where it gets insane. North of the Black Sea, beyond the edges of Darius's maps, lived a people who represented everything the Persian Empire was not. The Scythians, nomadic horse tribes who owned no cities, built no monuments, planted no crops. They lived in felt tents that could be packed and moved in hours. Their wealth was measured in horses, not gold. Their power came from mobility, not walls. The Greeks, who prided themselves on civilization and philosophy, were absolutely terrified of the Scythians. Herodotus, the father of history himself, wrote about them with a mixture of horror and fascination. The Scythians drank from the skulls of their enemies, turning them into ceremonial cups lined with gold. They scalped fallen foes, and wore the scalps as trophies. They practiced human sacrifice. Their warriors were so skilled with the composite bow that they could shoot backwards at full gallop, turning retreat into attack. Every Scythian male was a warrior from childhood. They learned to ride before they could walk. By age 5, they were practicing with small bows. By 10, they could hit targets from a galloping horse. By 15, they were full warriors who had spent more time on horseback than on foot. The Scythian composite bow was a technological marvel that rivaled anything the Persians possessed. Made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, glued together and cured for years, these bows could punch through armor at 200 yards. A skilled archer could loose 6 arrows per minute from horseback, maintaining accuracy while moving at full speed. The arrows themselves were designed with barbed points that made extraction agonizing. But what truly made Scythians formidable was their lifestyle. They owned nothing they couldn't carry. Their tents, their weapons, their entire civilization fit on horses and wagons. When enemies approached, they simply packed up and moved. There were no cities to besiege, no fields to burn, no temples to desecrate. Fighting Scythians was like trying to punch fog. The Greek city-states had learned this the hard way. Every attempt to establish colonies on the northern Black Sea coast had to negotiate with Scythians or face constant raids. The Greeks paid tribute, they bought peace, and even then they lived in fear of the horse tribes. In 514 BC, Darius decided the Scythians needed to learn submission. His stated reason was revenge for Scythian raids into Persian territory decades earlier. The real reason was simpler. Every people from India to Greece had knelt before Persian power. The Scythians had not. This was unacceptable. The engineering challenge alone was staggering. To invade Scythia, Darius needed to cross the Bosphorus Strait, the narrow waterway separating Asia from Europe. No army had ever crossed it. Darius ordered a bridge built. The bridge was a miracle of ancient engineering. Greek engineers, working under Persian supervision, lashed together hundreds of boats to create a pontoon bridge nearly a mile long. It could support the weight of 70,000 troops crossing simultaneously. The construction took 6 months and required coordination between dozens of Greek city-states who provided ships, materials, and expertise. When the bridge was complete, Darius assembled the largest army he had ever commanded. Sources vary, but conservative estimates place it at 600,000 to 700,000 men. Infantry from Persia, Media, and Babylon. Cavalry from the steppes of Central Asia. Greek hoplites serving as mercenaries. Supply trains with thousands of pack animals. Engineers with siege equipment, even though there would be no cities to siege. The Scythians watched the bridge being built and understood exactly what was coming. Their response revealed the fundamental difference between their worldview and the Persian one. They didn't fortify positions. They didn't assemble a counter-army. They didn't panic. They held a council of the 3 major Scythian tribes, the royal Scythians, the largest and most powerful, the Sauramatai, known for their female warriors, the Badini, who controlled the northern forests. The tribal chiefs debated strategy and reached a decision that would baffle the Persians for months. They would not fight, they would not surrender, they would simply move. The Scythian strategy was elegant in its simplicity. One tribe would stay ahead of the Persian army, always visible on the horizon, always retreating just fast enough to remain out of reach. The other 2 tribes would flank the Persians, burning the grass, poisoning the wells, driving away livestock, and conducting night raids to prevent sleep and sap morale. But wait, it gets worse for the Persians. The Scythians sent envoys to neighboring tribes, explaining the Persian threat. Some refused to help, believing the mighty Persian Empire was unstoppable. But others understood that if the Scythians fell, they would be next. The Geloni agreed to support the strategy. The Agathyrsi fortified their borders, but promised to harry any Persians who penetrated their territory. As Darius's massive army crossed the Bosphorus in the spring of 513 BC, the Scythians enacted their plan. They packed their tents, loaded their wagons, rounded up their herds, and began moving north into the endless steppe. The Persian army that crossed into Scythia was confident, professional, and completely unprepared for what was about to happen. They had conquered sedentary civilizations that defended fixed positions. They had besieged cities and stormed fortresses. They had never chased an entire people who treated land as temporary camping ground rather than sacred homeland. Darius sent scouts ahead. They reported Scythian camps visible on the northern horizon, perhaps 2 days' march away. The Persian army advanced. By the time they reached where the camps had been, they found only trampled grass and cold fire pits. The Scythians were gone, visible again on the horizon, always moving north. The chase had begun, and with every mile the Persians marched deeper into the steppe. They moved further from their supply lines, further from water sources, further from any hope of victory. The grass stretched endlessly in every direction. No mountains to provide landmarks. No rivers to follow. Just grass, wind, and an enemy that refused to stop moving long enough to be destroyed. Darius had invaded Scythia to teach nomads the price of defying empire. He was about to learn a far more expensive lesson. That conquest only works when there's something to conquer. And the Scythians owned nothing but freedom and horses, both of which they could take with them. Day 1 of the invasion, the Persian army marched north into grass that stretched to the horizon like a green ocean frozen in place. The supply train carried 60 days of food, enough for a typical campaign against a sedentary civilization. Water was expected to be found along the route. The Scythians had other plans. By day 3, the pattern became clear. Every well the Persians found had been filled with dirt and stones. Every stream they approached had been fouled with animal carcasses bloating in the sun. The grass ahead of them showed scorch marks where Scythians had set controlled fires, destroying fodder for Persian horses, while leaving just enough unburned land for their own mounts to graze on the flanks. The Scythian royal tribe stayed perpetually visible on the northern horizon, close enough to be seen, far enough to be unreachable. Persian cavalry would mount pursuit, riding hard for hours, only to find the Scythians had moved again, their horse herds leaving dust clouds that mocked Persian efforts. Here's where it gets insane. The Persians were winning every encounter. Small groups of Scythian scouts would appear, loose a few arrows, then vanish before Persian troops could close. Technically, these were Persian victories. The Scythians were fleeing, but with each victory, the Persian army marched deeper into emptiness, further from resupply, closer to catastrophe. By day 15th, the first casualties mounted, not from combat, from heat exhaustion. The summer sun turned the steppe into an oven. Soldiers carrying 60 pounds of equipment in temperatures exceeding 100 degrees began collapsing. The Persian medical corps treated hundreds daily. Dozens died. The Scythians, born to the steppe, moved during the cooler hours of dawn and dusk. They rested during the worst heat. They knew every water source, every shaded depression, every place where the grass grew thick enough to feed horses. The Persians knew nothing except the direction their scouts pointed. North, always north. Day 20. The supply situation became critical. Food reserves were below 40 days. Foraging parties sent to hunt game returned empty-handed. The Scythians had driven away every animal for miles around. Persian soldiers, accustomed to regular rations, began to weaken. The pace of march slowed. Day 25. The night raids began. Scythian warriors would approach Persian camps in the darkness, moving silently on foot, leading their horses. At a signal, they would mount, charge to within 50 yards of the camp perimeter, loose volleys of arrows into the sleeping troops, then vanish into the night before Persian cavalry could respond. The psychological impact was devastating. Soldiers couldn't sleep, knowing death might arrive with the next sound of hoofbeats. Sentries stared into darkness, jumping at every noise. Exhaustion compounded heat stress. Men began making mistakes, stumbling, hallucinating from lack of rest. Day 30. 1 month into the invasion, Darius called his war council and demanded answers. How much further to the Scythian heartland? Where were their cities? When would they stand and fight? His scouts had no answers. There was no heartland. There were no cities. The Scythians showed no sign of fighting. They just kept moving north, always visible, always unreachable. Here's where it gets worse. The Scythians' flanking tribes escalated their harassment. Sauramatai warriors, including the famed female archers who had inspired Greek legends of Amazons, struck supply columns in broad daylight. They would appear from hidden gullies, loose arrows into pack animals and supply wagons, then scatter before Persian troops could form battle lines. Food meant for the army burned or spoiled, water containers shattered, morale bled with every attack. By day 40, Persian soldiers were on half rations. Officers tried to maintain discipline, but hunger and exhaustion were eroding the army's cohesion. Men who had conquered Babylon and Egypt now stumbled through grass, chasing an enemy they couldn't catch, defending supplies they couldn't protect. Day 50. Darius made a decision born of frustration and imperial pride. He sent an envoy to the Scythian king, Edanthersus, with a message dripping with contempt. If you believe yourself strong enough to resist Persian power, stand and fight like men. If you acknowledge your weakness, send earth and water as tokens of submission. Stop fleeing like cowards and face the consequences of defying the King of Kings. The Scythian response arrived 3 days later, not in words, in gifts, 4 objects, carried by Scythian messengers who delivered them, without explanation, and rode away before questions could be asked. The gifts sat in Darius's command tent, while Persian nobles and generals tried to interpret their meaning: a bird, a mouse, a frog, and 5 arrows. The Persian war council debated for hours. Some thought the gifts were tokens of submission. The bird represented Scythian speed, which they were offering to Persian service. The mouse represented earth, the frog represented water, the arrows represented military might. All gifts were being surrendered to Darius, but one Persian noble, Gobryas, saw a darker message. His interpretation sent ice through the command tent despite the summer heat. Unless you Persians can fly like birds into the sky, or burrow like mice into the earth, or leap like frogs into the water, you will never escape our arrows. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind moving through the tent flaps, because in that moment the Persian high command understood something terrible. They weren't chasing the Scythians were leading them. Every day of pursuit had taken them deeper into a landscape with no shelter, no supplies, no escape routes, except the way they had come. Day 60. 2 months into the invasion. Food reserves critically low, water scarce. The army that had numbered perhaps 700,000 at the Bosphorus had lost tens of thousands to disease, desertion, and harassment. Dysentery had become epidemic. Men squatted in agony, their bowels turning to water, their strength draining into the grass. The Scythians sensed the crisis. Their raids intensified. No longer content with arrows from darkness, they began showing themselves in larger groups during daylight, taunting Persian cavalry into pursuit, then leading them in circles until the horses collapsed from exhaustion. Day 75. The Scythians did something unexpected. They offered battle. A Scythian force, perhaps 20,000 warriors, appeared on a ridgeline 5 miles ahead of the Persian advance. They were formed in clear battle lines, horses stamping, warriors visible. For the first time in 2.5 months, the enemy was standing still. Darius ordered immediate advance. This was it, the battle he had marched 500 miles to fight, the opportunity to crush Scythian power and justify the entire campaign. The Persian army, despite its weakened state, moved with professional discipline. Infantry formed the center. Cavalry took the wings. The immortals advanced in the vanguard. This was what they had been trained for, what they had marched so far to achieve. The distance closed, 2 miles, 1 mile, half a mile. Then the Scythians simply mounted their horses and rode away, not in panic, not in retreat. They turned and cantered north, maintaining formation, staying just out of bow range. By the time the Persians reached the ridgeline, the Scythians were gone, visible again on the northern horizon. It was worse than an ambush. It was mockery. The Scythians had dangled hope and snatched it away, proving they could fight whenever they chose. They simply chose not to. That night Darius called another council. The discussion was no longer about victory. It was about survival. 3 months into the invasion, food for 2 weeks remaining, 80,000 men dead from disease, exhaustion, and raids. No prospect of forcing battle, no hope of conquest. The only question was whether they could escape before the Scythians decided to stop playing and finish them. The retreat began the next morning, but the Persians didn't call it retreat. They called it strategic redeployment towards secondary objectives. The words didn't matter. Everyone in the army knew the truth. They had marched into Scythia as conquerors. They would march out as survivors if they were lucky. And the Scythians, who had never stood to fight a single pitched battle, had won the war without ever accepting Persian terms of engagement. They had proven something that would echo through military history for millennia, that the enemy who controls the definition of victory cannot be defeated by those who fight on conventional terms. The chase was over. The nightmare of retreat was just beginning. The gifts sat in Darius's tent like accusations. Bird, mouse, frog, arrows. Gobryas's interpretation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Unless you can fly, burrow, or leap into water, our arrows will find you. One Persian advisor, desperate to salvage pride from the growing disaster, offered an alternative reading. Perhaps the Scythians were offering their speed, their lands, their waters, and their military power to Darius. Perhaps this was elaborate submission from a people who didn't understand proper diplomatic protocol. No one believed him. Not anymore. Not after 3 months of being led in circles like children chasing butterflies. The retreat south began as an organized withdrawal, Persian discipline held despite exhaustion and hunger. But the Scythians had been waiting for exactly this moment, the moment when 600,000 invaders turned their backs and began the long march home. Here's what your history teacher never told you. The retreat was worse than the advance, far worse. During the invasion, the Persians had at least been moving toward a theoretical objective. Now they were simply fleeing, and the Scythians knew it. The harassment that had been irritating during the advance became lethal during retreat. Scythian warriors appeared on all sides now, not just harassing the flanks, but cutting off stragglers, isolating supply units, turning every mile into a gauntlet of arrows and terror. They would materialize from gullies and depressions invisible until the moment warriors rose from the grass, like demons summoned from earth itself. The killing was surgical. The Scythians didn't waste arrows on massed formations. They targeted officers identifiable by better armor. They shot horses carrying supplies. They killed scouts so the Persians marched half blind. Every arrow meant something. Every death served a purpose. Day 80. The dysentery that had been manageable became catastrophic. Men stumbled from the marching column to squat in the grass, too weak to maintain dignity, too sick to care. Some didn't get up again. Those who collapsed were left behind. The army couldn't afford to slow down. Behind them, Scythian scouts watched and waited. Once the main column passed, they would finish the dying. No one spoke of it. Everyone knew. Day 85. Water became more precious than gold. The Scythians had spent 3 months poisoning wells and fouling streams during the advance. Now, those same contaminated sources were all the Persians had. Men drank from puddles, knowing the water was bad, choosing slow death from disease over immediate death from thirst. Heat exhaustion claimed hundreds daily. Soldiers would simply stop walking, sit down in the grass, and refuse to rise. Officers would shout, threaten, even beat them. Most didn't respond. They had reached the limit of human endurance and found it wanting. They sat and waited for the Scythians or the heat to claim them. Day 90, 3 months of retreat. The Persian army was disintegrating. Units mixed as discipline eroded. The immortals, who had maintained formation throughout the advance, now walked in loose groups, their legendary cohesion broken by starvation and exhaustion. The cavalry had abandoned many of their mounts, the horses too weak to carry riders. But wait, it gets worse. The Scythians, sensing the army's collapse, changed tactics. Instead of harassment, they attempted encirclement. Thousands of horse archers appeared ahead of the Persian line of march, blocking the route south. Behind them, more Scythians closed in, attempting to trap the entire army in a pocket of grass and death. For the first time in the campaign, the Scythians were offering something resembling battle, not because they wanted to fight on Persian terms, but because they wanted to annihilate the invaders completely. Darius faced the choice that would define his reign: stand and fight with an army that could barely stand, or break through at any cost and reach the Bosphorus bridge 200 miles away. He chose survival over pride. The Persian army charged the Scythian blocking force with everything left. The immortals led, their exhaustion forgotten in the desperate knowledge that death waited in all directions. Behind them, what remained of the cavalry gathered for one final effort. Infantry followed, knowing this was their only chance. The Scythians, true to their nature, refused to stand and receive the charge. They fired volleys, then withdrew, fired again, withdrew again. But the Persians kept coming, driven by the animal desperation of trapped men who understand that stopping means dying. For 3 hours, the two forces moved across the steppe in a deadly dance. Scythians firing and retreating, Persians advancing through arrow storms. Men fell by the hundreds. But the Persian mass, even weakened, was too large to completely stop. The Scythian encirclement broke. The route south was open, at the cost of another 3,000 men left dead or dying on the grass. Day 95. The bridge over the Bosphorus became more than a geographical objective. It became salvation itself. Every stumbling step brought them closer to Europe, to supply lines, to water that wasn't poisoned, and food that wasn't memory. Then scouts brought news that turned Darius's blood to ice. The Scythians had sent envoys to the Ionian Greeks guarding the bridge. The message was simple and devastating. Destroy the bridge. Trap the Persian army in Scythia. We will finish them, and you will be free from Persian rule forever. The Greeks held council. Miltiades of Athens, the same man who would later defeat the Persians at Marathon, argued passionately for destroying the bridge. We'll never have a better chance. The Persian army is destroyed. Darius is fleeing for his life. Cut the bridge, and we cut the throat of the empire that has enslaved us. But Histiaeus of Miletus saw further. If we trap Darius, Persia will send another army, one that's fresh, angry, and seeking revenge. Better to let Darius escape, humiliated but alive. A weakened Persia is better than an enraged one. The Greeks debated through the night while the Scythians waited for their answer, and Darius's army stumbled south, not knowing if their escape route still existed, or if the bridge they'd crossed in triumph 3 months ago had become their tomb. The Greeks made their decision. They would wait. They would let Darius reach the bridge. They would maintain the fiction of Persian dominance, while storing the memory of Persian weakness for future use. Day 100. The Persian army, or what remained of it, reached the Bosphorus. The bridge still stood. The Greeks still guarded it, maintaining their neutral expressions, while watching 600,000 men reduced to a quarter of that stumble back across the strait they had crossed with such confidence. Darius himself was among the last to cross. He turned and looked back at the Scythian steppe one final time. Somewhere in that endless grass, the horse tribes were watching, laughing perhaps, or simply moving on to the next grazing ground, already forgetting the empire that had learned an expensive lesson in their territory. The casualties were staggering. Conservative estimates placed Persian dead at 80,000 men, not from a single great battle, not from a siege that failed, from 3 months of being led in circles by an enemy that refused to fight on Persian terms. The Scythians lost perhaps 2,000 warriors in the entire campaign, most of those in the final encirclement attempt, when they had briefly abandoned their strategy and tried to destroy the Persians outright. The mathematics were brutal. 80,000 Persians dead to kill 2,000 Scythians, a 40-to-1 casualty ratio in favor of the nomads. The greatest empire on earth had been humiliated by tribes that owned nothing permanent, defended nothing fixed, and understood that sometimes the best way to win is to refuse to lose on the enemy's terms. As the last Persian soldiers crossed the bridge and engineers began dismantling it behind them, the truth settled like dust after a storm. The Scythians had won, not through superior numbers or better weapons or tactical brilliance in battle. They had won by understanding something the Persians couldn't grasp. That conquest only works when there's something to conquer. That armies designed to storm cities and hold territory become liabilities in spaces where there are no cities to storm and no territory worth holding. The Scythians had turned the steppe itself into a weapon. Emptiness became fortress. Distance became defense. Refusal became victory. And 80,000 Persians would never tell anyone how they had died chasing an enemy that refused to be caught. As Darius crossed back into Europe, the empire faced something it had never encountered before: defeat without battle, humiliation without conquest, the mathematical impossibility of losing 80,000 men to an enemy that had never stood to fight. The immediate aftermath was brutal for Persian prestige. News of the disaster spread through the empire like plague. The satraps who had watched Darius march north with the greatest army ever assembled now watched him return with a broken force, his pride shattered, his reputation damaged beyond repair. In Babylon, Scribes recorded the campaign in official chronicles with careful language. The King of Kings conducted operations in Scythia. The barbarians declined battle, strategic objectives reassessed. The truth was buried beneath bureaucratic prose, but everyone who could read between the lines understood. The mighty Persian Empire had been humbled by horse nomads. In Egypt, recently conquered and resentful of Persian rule, the news sparked hope. If the Scythians could resist, perhaps others could too. The seeds of rebellion were planted in soil fertilized by Darius's failure. Among the Ionian Greeks who had witnessed the retreat, a more immediate lesson was learned. The Persian army wasn't invincible. It could be bled. It could be broken. It just required the right strategy and the willingness to refuse conventional engagement. 27 years later, when Darius's son Xerxes invaded Greece, the defenders would remember the Scythian example. But here's where it gets insane from a cultural perspective. The Greeks didn't just learn tactics from the disaster. They learned about the Scythians themselves, and what they learned terrified them more than Persian armies ever could. Herodotus, writing in his histories 2 generations later, devoted an entire book to Scythian customs. His account, based on Greek traders who had lived among the tribes, painted a picture of a people fundamentally alien to Mediterranean sensibilities. The Scythians drank the blood of the first enemy they killed. They scalped fallen foes and tanned the scalps to wear as towels. They made drinking cups from enemy skulls, lining them with gold if the deceased had been particularly worthy. They practiced ritual human sacrifice, killing prisoners to honor their gods. Their shamans consumed hemp in enclosed tents, emerging in prophetic trances. But Herodotus also recorded their tactical genius with grudging respect. He described their strategy against Darius in detail, preserving for history the playbook of asymmetric warfare that would be studied for millennia. Refuse engagement on enemy terms, control space through mobility, turn geography into weapon, make the enemy's strength, size, organization, supply systems into fatal weakness. The Scythians themselves left no written records. They had no cities to build monuments in, no scribes to chronicle victories. Their story survives only in the accounts of enemies and trading partners who encountered them and lived to tell about it. What we know comes from 3 sources: Greek historians like Herodotus, Persian administrative records that mention Scythian territories in bureaucratic language, and archaeology. Here's what modern excavations have revealed. The Scythian kurgans, burial mounds scattered across the steppe from Ukraine to Kazakhstan, contain treasures that confirm the Greek accounts. Goldwork of extraordinary sophistication, weapons designed for horseback combat, evidence of a nomadic culture that was wealthy, organized, and far more complex than barbarian suggests. A kurgan excavated in 1971 near Pazyryk in Siberia, preserved by permafrost, contained the frozen remains of a Scythian warrior and his horses. The level of preservation was stunning, tattoos still visible on the warrior's skin, depicting mythical animals in intricate detail. Felt saddle cloths embroidered with scenes of combat. A wooden saddle designed for the kind of mobile archery that had terrorized the Persians. But wait, it gets worse for historical assumptions. DNA analysis of Scythian remains, conducted in the 21st century, revealed that some of the warriors buried in kurgans were women, not camp followers or wives, warriors, buried with the same weapons, armor, and honors as men. The Greek legends of Amazons weren't entirely myth. They were distorted memories of Sauromatai and Scythian cultures, where women fought alongside men. The archaeological evidence confirms what the written sources had claimed. The Scythians were sophisticated, wealthy, and organized. They weren't primitive tribes lucky enough to survive Persian attention. They were a military culture that had evolved specifically for steppe warfare, and when that culture met an army designed for conventional siege warfare, the result was inevitable. The strategic consequences of Darius's failure rippled through decades. The Persian Empire never again attempted northern expansion. The Scythian steppe remained unconquered, a blank space on Persian maps labelled with variations of "here live people who cannot be subjugated." More importantly, the Greeks had watched the entire disaster. When Xerxes invaded Greece in 480 BC, leading an even larger army than his father had taken to Scythia, the Greek defenders understood something crucial. Large armies had weaknesses. Supply lines could be stretched. Terrain could be weaponized. Refusing to fight on the enemy's terms was a valid strategy. The Spartans at Thermopylae used geography to negate Persian numbers, holding a narrow pass for 3 days. The Athenians at Salamis used naval mobility to defeat a larger Persian fleet in confined waters. The entire Greek defensive strategy echoed the Scythian playbook. Force the enemy to fight in spaces where their advantages become liabilities. Modern military strategists still study the Scythian campaign against Darius. The US Army War College includes it in curricula on asymmetric warfare. The lesson hasn't changed in 2,500 years. When facing superior force, control the terms of engagement. Make the enemy fight on your ground, by your rules, or don't fight at all. The parallels to more recent conflicts are impossible to ignore. The Mongols, ironically descendants of steppe peoples related to the Scythians, would use similar tactics to build their own empire centuries later. The Russian strategy against Napoleon and Hitler both employed scorched earth and strategic depth. The North Vietnamese against America, the Afghans against Soviets and Americans alike. The playbook is ancient, proven, and endlessly repeatable. Refuse to defend fixed positions, trade space for time, harass supply lines, make occupation more costly than invasion, turn the enemy's size from advantage to liability, wait for exhaustion, disease, and demoralization to do what your arrows cannot. The Scythians wrote that playbook in grass and blood on the steppe in 513 BC, and empires have been relearning it ever since. As for the Scythians themselves, they remained dominant on the steppe for another 300 years. They traded with Greeks, fought with Persians, and maintained their nomadic lifestyle until the Sarmatians, another horse people, eventually displaced them around 200 BC. Even then, they didn't disappear. They merged, migrated, evolved into new tribal confederations. Their gold work influenced Greek and Persian art. Their tactical innovations influenced every cavalry force that came after. Their genetic legacy appears in populations from Eastern Europe to Central Asia. They left no cities to excavate, but they left something more enduring. They left proof that empire has limits, that power has boundaries, that sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to lose on the conqueror's terms. When Darius died in 486 BC, 27 years after his Scythian disaster, Persian chronicles listed his accomplishments: conquests in Egypt, India, Thrace, the construction of Persepolis, administrative reforms that would last centuries. The Scythian campaign was mentioned in a single line, if at all, the defeat too shameful for elaboration. But in Greek taverns and around Scythian campfires, the story grew. The tale of how 600,000 men had marched into the steppe and learned that conquest only works when there's something to conquer. How the greatest army on earth had chased ghosts through grass until the ghosts won. The mathematical impossibility became historical fact. The empire that ruled 44% of humanity couldn't defeat tribes that owned nothing but horses and freedom, because you can't conquer people who won't stand still. You can't siege cities that don't exist. You can't hold territory that holds no value. When the steppe met empire, the steppe won. When permanence chased motion, motion stayed ahead. When the world's greatest army demanded battle on their terms, the Scythians simply rode away, and in riding away, they wrote a lesson in blood and grass that survives when their very names have faded from common knowledge. They came as invaders. They left as survivors, if they were lucky. And the people who taught them this lesson, they mounted their horses, packed their tents, and moved on to the next grazing ground, already forgetting the empire that had learned fear in their territory. Because to the Scythians, Darius was just another foreign king who didn't understand the first rule of the steppe. That freedom cannot be conquered when freedom refuses to stand and be measured by conquerors' terms. The grass grows over their bones now, Persian and Scythian alike. But the lesson remains, carved into every military manual that acknowledges asymmetric warfare. Some victories are won by standing firm, others are won by refusing to stand at all, and sometimes the greatest triumph is making your enemy chase you until they break themselves against the emptiness you've turned into a weapon.